Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this, the first develop event of 2023, which is on how you can fast track your career. My name is Jeremy Pigeon. I'm the Alumni Programs Manager here. And on to our topic of discussion for today's event. I think we'll all agree that sometimes it's very easy to fall into where you think your career progression is one nice smooth curve and everything's assured. And many of us have felt as if our career progression has stalled, or we're watching friends and colleagues get promotions and go for new jobs and we feel stuck. So if any of you have been there before, or if you feel like that right now, you are in luck. Our speaker today brings all her knowledge, her insight, her experience to us to share with us for the next hour, providing some tips and tricks that'll help you with your career goals, how to achieve them, and how to supercharge your career progression. It is my great pleasure to introduce Sameena Bashey as today's speaker. An MBA graduate from Newcastle, Sameena has over 30 years of HR experience in some of the biggest multinational corporations, and in 2020 set up her own consulting business. So without further ado, and to not steal any more of her thunder, I will pass on to Sameena.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, and it's absolutely fabulous to be here with you all today. It'd be great to know where you're dialing in from, so please do use the chat box. I'm going to ask Jeremy to kind of give us his inputs as we go, because I won't always be looking at the chat, but don't hesitate, type in where you're dialing in from and get a feel for, where you're from, tell us more if you wish. And as Jeremy said, would love to take questions. I'll try my best to pause at certain points, and Jeremy's going to hopefully help me monitor that chat box, and, we can have a bit of a dialogue, hopefully time allowing, and perhaps also do a lot more if you've got certain issues in terms of your career that you want more of a case study on. Please do drop us an email afterwards. We could cover that next week. I certainly don't think we'll have time to get into that level of detail today. But look, let me kick off today to tell you what we're going to be covering. And, this kind of gives you a bit of an content for today's session. I will tell you more about my career journey so that you can see kind of where I'm coming from. It also helps you see how some of the decisions I made. I think when you talk about career, I do like to have a framework that we can use. It just helps me kind of structure things in a certain way. And so today I'm going to be sharing the 5 Ps framework, and that is a purpose, as you can see on the page, and really helping you understand, what you want to achieve, what success looks like for you, how do you find your dream job? And then, how to go about the planning phase, because a lot of the times we don't really plan our careers. And so I'm going to try and share some tips along those lines. Also, for those who are busy putting their CVs together, I'm more than happy to, give a few tips on that. Talk more on performance, because once you're in an organization, what do you do to really accelerate your performance? Think about the behaviors. A lot of people think it's all about deliverables, but it's also the how. And partnerships. This is really all those relationships and networks that we know end up being as critical, and sometimes even more critical than your performance. And then finally, how to pivot. So P for pivot, which is really all about adapting to career challenges. We all have them, whether it happens to be health challenges, whether it could be redundancies. How do you stay resilient through that time? And what do you do to ensure you have continued success? So as I said, please don't hesitate, use the chat box, get your Q&As in. And before we go any further, Jeremy, have we got much in terms of where people are dialing in from today? Do you want to just shout up and, give me a view, or are people being cautious?
We've got a few people who are dialing in from, I'd hesitate to say sunny Newcastle, but Newcastle. A number of people are dialing in from London. We've got somebody who's dialing in from Denmark today. So yeah, we've got people from all over the place, which is,
and it is open to people around the globe today. So hopefully we've got a good section right across the globe today. Okay, so starting off then, I thought what would be good was to tell you a little bit about my career journey. And when I was at school doing my A-levels, my parents actually wanted me to be an accountant. They felt that because I was doing maths, I must be into figures. And actually, it was whilst I was having, doing some work experience whilst I was at school in an accountancy firm, that I realized that actually I wasn't as interested in figures as I was people. And I was fascinated by how the mind works and why people behave in the way that they do. So instead of studying accountancy, I actually studied psychology, quite different to what my parents expected, I suspect. And I have to say, I absolutely loved it, and when you're doing your degree, and I suspect many folks on the call today may have graduated, not necessarily knowing what they want to do. And when I have to say, I was the same. I was about to graduate with a psychology degree, not being very clear on what which career path I wanted to follow. And I knew that I was very motivated by organizational psychology, looking at, what engaged people at work, what was driving them, what was motivating them. But this is going back 30 years ago, where occupational psychology, there wasn't a million jobs out there, certainly not in Newcastle at the time. And so I had to really rethink what I was going to do from a career standpoint. I knew that was an area I was interested in. And at that time, the university helped me go through various kind of career surveys to identify what careers I would be suited to. And I recall getting a conclusion of a list of jobs at the end. And one of those jobs said personnel management or human resource management. It was actually known as personnel then. I didn't even know what that was. And I thought, I wonder what that is. And when I looked into it, I actually thought, wow, this actually sounds really interesting. And it certainly is about people, certainly about organizations, certainly looking at how you can motivate and engage people in the workplace. And so I decided that actually that's probably the career path I should follow. Very different to if you think about, where I was starting. And at that point, I needed to go and do a postgrad in, human resource management, because just to build my knowledge and skill set. And what I've done on this next page is really try to show you the sort of path my career followed. And actually here, you can see after I finished, HR, like a lot of graduates, I wasn't even thinking about, having a great career plan at that time. I just wanted to take the first job that I was offered. And that's what I did. I joined, local government, and within sort of a year, 18 months, realized that the culture wasn't right for me. I was looking to work, in a fast-paced environment, making decisions very quickly. So soon moved to other organizations and worked across various industry sectors, as Jeremy mentioned, working in the hotel sector, working in manufacturing, in media. This is all prior to joining GE. You'll also notice that I went back to education to do my MBA sort of about, a number of years into my career. One, because I wanted to improve my business knowledge, but also I really wanted to differentiate myself. I was really now starting to think about my career and how to differentiate myself from other HR people that I would be competing with in jobs. And the MBA certainly, did open a lot of doors for me. And realistically, it also helped me join companies like GE. And, prior to joining GE in my 20s, just to share more of my personal scenario, I got married in my 20s. I had children very early in my 20s. So there were times early on in my career where I had to actually slow down, partly because I was trying to manage a lot of things at home. And so after my MBA, and as my kids grew older, I joined GE, and that opened a lot of global doors for me because there was a lot of global opportunities. I was able to take on HR director roles in a variety of industry sectors like oil and gas, healthcare, GE Capital, responsible for thousands of employees across the globe, and was very involved in also making career decisions on who got promoted, who didn't. And again, I'm going to share some of those tips and thoughts with you because often it's things we don't think about. And then, when my husband retired quite early from a career standpoint, I decided actually this was time to have a career shift and reinvent what you want to do, and decided to set up my own business in consulting. I was traveling all over the place. I was traveling not only globally, you'll see some of my locations. I was quite restricted by my location, partly because of my family commitments, my husband's job. But with GE, I was able to take roles in other cities and have a commuting career. And this is going back 10, 13 years ago, where remote working wasn't the thing, but I was doing that. So even though my jobs were based in London and Paris, I was literally just flying to those cities every week for 2 or 3 days. And that's one way of carving up your jobs, even when you have restrictions in life. And we can talk more about that as well. So anyway, what I do now is I basically coach executive leaders. My aim and my purpose is to help leaders excel, not only in their leadership, but also in transforming themselves, their teams, their business, and also, how they look at their careers. And here's some of the companies that I currently work with. So this is really what my purpose is all about. And this is what I do now, and work largely virtually with global leaders. So now let's turn to yourselves and, look at how you can take control of your career, because this is something that has to have much more proactive management than we actually think. And realistically, this is why I'm very keen on having a model or a framework that's useful to think through. And, I will spend some time going through each of these different dimensions on this model and help think through what you need to consider and what you might need to do differently as you plan and think ahead from a career standpoint. So before I kick off and go into the likes of what's your purpose, how can you plan better, as well as, how you can accelerate your performance and build these strong partnerships and learn to pivot, I am going to pause for a second, Jeremy, just in case, because I'm not actually monitoring the chat myself. I'm hoping Jeremy is. So Jeremy, is there anything that's coming up, or any questions or things people have maybe, contacted you directly about before I kick off some of this?
We've had a couple more people tell us where they're from. So I think the furthest person out now is from Canada, which is great to see.
Fantastic. Pretty early in the morning there, so hope you're wide awake.
Very, very impressed that they got up to dial in. There's not been specific questions on what you've said so far, but we have had some in, and I think something that comes through quite clearly is things like how to ensure that this advice and tips and tricks are versatile for us, a broad range of audience, because I think people can get very easily bogged down and going, oh, well, I work in finance or oil and gas, or I'm an architect, so this advice only doesn't apply to me. And actually it's thinking about how you can almost reset that thought process to say, how
actually,
can
Jeremy, that's a great point. And please, look, I think the things I'm going to cover are pretty generic. So I know you might think, well, okay, you've worked largely in the corporate world, and, I'm kind of working, I have my own, work in a small setup here, or do something completely different. You'll be amazed how much of this can be applied. I was actually talking to a doctor yesterday, and he was telling me how he could have applied some of these things to his role. So, I'm hoping it's going to be generic enough. So thanks, Jeremy, for that. So let me continue if there isn't anything specific right now. But again, don't hesitate to ask questions as we go. So look, I really like to start with purpose, right? Because life is short. You might be thinking, gosh, I've got 40 plus years to work. It depends on which stage you're at in your career. Some of you are much further down the line and, been in your roles for 10, 15 years. So realistically, I think it is always important to examine what it is you want to achieve. Sometimes we get offered jobs, often once we've, say, perhaps when we studied, and then we go down a particular path, not really spending time thinking about our careers. But I think it's time to pause, right? Time to pause and really reflect on how you want to impact the world. If you were coming to the end of your career, what would you like to have achieved? What would success look like to you? And it's not always about, hopefully it's not always about, making lots of money and stuff, but it's really about, how are you going to be satisfied with what you've achieved? So if you haven't spent a lot of time doing that, this is absolutely critical. And I will talk a little bit more about what that entails. I quite like this particular quote by Richard Branson, and I think it kind of sums it up, because really, if you follow your passion and do something that's actually going to serve the world, you'll find you're going to have, great career fulfillment, because you're not only serving the world, you're serving yourself as well. And one of the models I like to use is this one. I'm going to kind of pause here because I just want to talk through some of this detail, because a lot of people say to me, Sameena, I don't really know what my purpose is. I don't really know what I would be fulfilled doing. And if that's the case, I think you've got to look at it perhaps in a few ways. Firstly, start with, why do you get out of bed every morning? What gets you really energized? What types of work do you find most interesting in your day, or the types of work you might have done in the past if it's not the way you're feeling right now, i.e. energized? Think also about the sort of your own personal values, personality. I'll give you more examples on that in a few minutes. But it's all very well being, having a passion, okay? But you also have to consider, what are your strengths? What are you talented in? Sometimes people aren't always clear about their strengths. If you're not, yes, of course, you can do a variety of surveys and tests, various things available online, etc. But also great ways, asking people you work with, asking your family, asking friends. They'll be able to tell you what you're particularly good at. Some of the skills that you haven't necessarily even thought about. What's really differentiating you is really what's important here. And then, it's finding something that other people need. Is there a demand for your passion and your skill set, right? Because if you have a talent, but actually nobody necessarily wants that, or there's not a huge demand for it. It's a bit like when I started thinking, I'll do occupational psychology. At the time, I couldn't see a lot of great roles there available. So, okay, so what else could meet my needs? Where is the demand? And there was certainly a lot of demand for HR people, and always has been. So it's trying to find where these circles intersect, which is going to give you that career fulfillment and hopefully clarity on your purpose. And, there's a lot of factors you do need to consider. For example, what type of personality you have. So take some time to do a self-exploration. We don't spend a lot of time really, thinking about ourselves and understanding ourselves better, and what it is that motivates us, what makes us tick. Personality does often impact your career choice. If you're a high extrovert and need to be around lots of people all the time, you're unlikely to, I don't want to stereotype, but you're unlikely to want to work by yourself in a lab. That might not get you all excited. If you're a highly confident person, you're more likely to be comfortable doing jobs others might not. You might be happy being a TV presenter, whereas others might. And so I know I'm stereotyping here, but think through some of the characteristics of your personality, but also your value set. Now, I know there's a lot of words on this page, but what I like to do is, when I'm sort of, coaching individuals, etc., I quite like to give them these different jigsaw pieces and with words on, and ask them to pick maybe 5 words that they feel are really important to them. What they see as really their major values in the workplace, not necessarily in the workplace, but in life. Okay. And this is quite useful. For example, let's say you picked 5 of, these pieces. Maybe you pick, say, achievements important to you, challenge is important to you, learning is important to you, variety is important to you, and autonomy is important to you. I'm just picking any 5 now. And if you're in your current job and you are finding you're not being stretched, you're not learning a lot, there's not a lot of autonomy because you have to do things in a very prescriptive manner, you're soon going to find that your job is not that aligned to your values. And this is really quite useful, again, in thinking through your career and perhaps some of the choices that you make. Another thing that, I did touch on earlier is also choosing the organization that you want to work in, because, you know, does that fit with your values? It's really important. I know, for instance, you know, if relationships and collaborating is really key to you, I mean, it is to most people, you might choose that you might work in an organization where you feel that, you know, people don't particularly, it's dysfunctional, people don't like each other, they are not good to each other. You know, you're going to find it uncomfortable to be in that sort of environment. So what's the culture like of the organization you're about to join, or in does it align with your value set? And I think that's another factor that gets overlooked, and people make mistakes by going into roles where actually things aren't aligning to how they had thought they would in terms of their values, etc. So I'm going to pause again here, Jeremy, just to, you know, just in case there's some thoughts coming to you. I know people have submitted questions to you prior as well. Is there anything that's coming up here that's you know, something you want to ask about, or people are asking about?
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff which is great. One question that I think fit in with your skills and experience, bit which we might tackle now or possibly later, is how do you gain experience needed when applying for new jobs? So they've suggested things like project management or funding bids or leadership roles, because your current role might not provide you with that experience, but you kind of hit that bottleneck of going, well, I need that to make the next step.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a catch-22, and it's a question that I get asked very regularly. So look, you're quite right. Sometimes you don't have that experience, right? Now, you've got to think about, is there a way of getting that experience in your current job? Like you mentioned project management. There may be opportunities for you to be able to put your hand up and actually take on some kind of project, okay, which then allows you to gain some skill sets on project management, which then you might decide, okay, actually, I'm also going to study in my spare time and do some project management type of qualifications, because even though I don't have that experience, I can say, I know what it takes to manage projects. Or, you know, often you can get experience by people, you know, I get amazed by the fact that people often do things outside of their work to get experience to help them later inside their work, as a way of doing it, to be able to get that. So I totally understand. There is definitely a bit of a, you know, the leadership one is a classic example where they say, oh, you need to have managed people. And you think, well, okay, well, I haven't, but then how do I now get a role at the first step up?
Yeah.
And this might mean you going to your manager and looking at, is there ways you can be supervising other people, perhaps taking some people off your manager who are less experienced, maybe far less experienced than yourselves, where you could supervise them on a day-to-day basis, not necessarily be the actual manager in the organization, but supervise them so that you can then put on your CV, you know, supervising a number of people right now. Look, it doesn't mean that that's your job, but it at least shows you've got some experience in handling that supervision of employees. So there's lots of ways you can be creative in looking at that. And I think this leads very nicely into the next section, which is all about planning that career. I mean, Jeremy, do you want to ask anything else?
I had just two quick points. One on that, which was it's a virtuous circle. If you put your hand up to say, I'd like to get experience in this, or help me get experience in X, then you're more likely to get more experience the next time around, because your boss will remember that you were proactive. So it's a
fantastic point, Jeremy. And honestly, the number of times that you put your hand up, and I will talk about that relationship with your boss, where you are kind of much more open about the things you want to do or the experiences you want to have. You know, people always think, oh, you know what, I'm going to quit my job and go. Well, have you talked to your boss about what you want to do? Because actually there might be opportunities that you're missing out on. And it's a great point. If you don't ask, you don't get, right? So I think that is really critical.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. I'm gonna move on, but
go ahead.
Yeah, no. I mean, the chances are your next questions are probably going to link in with the next piece. So please don't hesitate. I just want to be able to at least cover some of the key things. But Jeremy, do jump in as you feel, right? And, please do keep your questions coming. If we don't get to them today, we certainly will next week. So the next part is, okay, let's say you've established your purpose and you've got an idea of what you want to achieve in your life or in your career, or what really gets you excited. Now, let's really take time to plan, right? And this is really, you've got a long-term vision, but what are the short-term goals to help you get to that long-term vision? And Jeremy's already touched on some of that in terms of the experience, or where are the gaps? Like we just talked about, in terms of experience, skills, knowledge. Does it mean you have to go back and take some qualification that you don't have, etc.? The other thing I mentioned earlier on the organizations you want to work in, again, do some research on that. A key question is, is your CV current and impactful? People often don't bother putting updating their CV unless they're looking for a job, but actually great to have your CV always current and taking time to think about, and you might say, well, is that really necessary? You'll be amazed how you suddenly get called on your CV and you there's nothing like having something ready to go, or with just having some tweaks to it. The other important thing, as I mentioned earlier, was creating these opportunities. And as Jeremy said, highlighting it to the organization, highlighting it to your boss, to your peers. This is really important. And also, I often have people, telling me they're about to quit their job, and I get amazed that they don't always have a plan in place as to where they're going, what they're going to do. And I will always say to them, are you running away from your current job, or are you, or do you have something great to run to? So it's that whole, a lot of people are running away from their current job, and that's not the best way to make a career move. It's far better to be running to something exciting, something you want to do. So before you quit, think about how you can position yourself in that place so that you're not quitting with nothing to go to. Way easier to get another job if you're working versus not. And I'm sure there'll be, possible questions around that. But I think these are sort of important points. And I will pause in a few minutes as when we get to the end of this section to maybe take some more questions as we go. But look, I think people assume, it's only your experience and your qualifications that employers look for. What most companies, and I won't say all companies, but, in my experience, no matter what sector you're working in, etc., companies look for certain attributes when they're recruiting. It's a given that you'll have, just to get an interview, usually you've got the qualifications, you've got the experience. Then they're looking at some of these other factors, right? And often you'll be asked at interview about these things. People want individuals who are great relationship builders, who can communicate in a way that, people can understand. They're going to be reliable and accountable. They're going to get stuff done. They're going to take responsibility for their actions. They're going to be people who want to share information and knowledge with others versus just keep things to themselves. There's also going to be people look for those who are going to be willing to learn and grow because they want them to progress in the organization. Those who are really geared around delivering for the customer, wanting to, take on tough challenges. The other factor is, how adaptable are you in terms of there's going to be uncertainty in the workplace. There's new things that are going to be given to you. Are you going to panic, or are you going to be agile to really, be able to adapt to some of the changes? And then the whole authenticity thing is, do you actually, what you say and what you do, are they aligned, or are you kind of, do you say one thing and actually don't do what you say? The other thing that's really important is that people who are, want to improve themselves, they recognize that they have to be more self-aware. And then also, how do you make decisions? How do you make judgments? Do you think clearly through problems in solving problems? So these are fairly generic things, no matter where you're working. Having this sort of basic attributes is important, and at least important to be able to talk about with clear examples of when you've dealt with uncertainty, or how you've delivered under pressure, or, you know, the way you've kind of improved yourself through learning, through feedback, you know. So there's a lot of things here worth thinking about. And then finally, around things to do with the CV. You know, I in my career have looked at a lot of CVs, and here's just 5 quick tips, because honestly, you could have a whole session separate on CVs, which we haven't got time for. But, you know, I think the first thing I would say is there's nothing worse than getting like pages and pages of a CV. Okay, so if you're able to condense your CV into 1 or 2 pages, it shows that you are able to, you know, get to the key points. It kind of tells something about how you communicate, right? So less is more, actually. I was talking to a senior executive the other day who, you know, was saying, oh, I'm not sure I can get my CV down to 1 page with all the years of well, you know, 1 to 2 pages, that's what we want to get to. So how do you do that, right? People want to have a very quick snapshot of what you are like. So have an impactful personal profile about you that just tells people, you know, about whether you might say, you know, you're a finance expert who's driven transformations across the business. You've worked in a variety of global locations. It's just like 3 or 4 lines of what differentiates you, that brings, you know, so people can actually, you know, focus on what you're like as an individual. And under each of your roles, you often get people writing paragraphs about their responsibilities. Actually, we're far more interested in what have you actually achieved. So have clear, simple bullets on what you delivered. And by that, give metrics. If you were able to increase sales by X%, say it. If you were able to make a massive budget saving of this much, say it. If you achieved an award for your fantastic outcome, say it. You know, it's things that people can go, wow, this person's worth seeing. And I love the use of powerful language. Don't tone it down. This is about selling you. I know it feels like, oh gosh, I'm bragging, but we want to use words like transformed, improved, changed, led, delivered. These are all action, fast-moving words that make people think you get stuff done. And then the other important point is a CV should be tailored for each job. I know people just churn out the same CV for whatever job they're applying for. Actually, look at the job, look at what it's asking for, and tailor your CV to emphasize things that are linked specifically to that job. So that's just my 5 quick tips on CVs. The last thing I'll say before I pause, guys, is, you know, when you're wanting this career fulfillment, a lot of the times people think, oh, the only way actually is to go up in an organization is career progression. But sometimes you might have to take a downward step, especially if you're changing functions and you want to, you know, so sometimes you have to go down to go back up, right? So be comfortable that there may be right times to do that. Sounds bizarre, but I can think of many examples where I knew somebody who moved from HR to finance and actually had to take a bit of a downward step in their career because they were further up, just to get some of the basic grounding before they could be promoted to more senior levels. Lateral moves, not uncommon. Get a different experience. It might be a different type of industry. It might be a role using a different type of skill set, but it's a lateral move. It's not necessarily an upward move. You might stay in your job just to enrich it with lots of new projects, ways of making it far more meaningful, also can give you fulfillment. You might think about a portfolio career where you're actually doing a lot of unrelated things that just, you know, motivate you. And this is becoming more and more common with people, where they don't just always want to do one thing. And sometimes the only answer is to move out because you're leaving to another organization which offers you different opportunities. So here's some of the thoughts you have. And I know I'm going through this kind of fairly quickly, but let me just quickly pause again, Jeremy, on, you know, what if there's any quick questions.
There's been lots actually, and I'm sure we won't get to all of them, but we'll try. One that came through that was really interesting, which actually was from a slightly earlier point, which was how do you fit all your various job experiences and qualifications experience into one cohesive package? Like, as you said, a lot of the time people jump from job to job, company to company, organization to organization. And it's quite easy to look at your CV and go, well, I've got a weird smorgasbord of experiences and ideas and projects and passions, and I don't quite know how to make that into a unified whole. So one of the questions was, how is there a way to kind of get that all?
It is, and it probably requires a lot more detailed around it, and we may need to park it. But look, I think in reality, you're right. Sometimes you have to look at the actual individual, the experiences they have, and how do you summarize that, which kind of, and it may be that then you're using some of that in your personal profile to kind of give a quick summary of the sort of things or the skill sets that you bring, right? Which might have come from different jobs. It might be that you kind of look at how, you know, especially if I'm telling you to condense your CV and you don't want to expand it with a load of stuff, right? So often you can club things together, but people do like to see the types of jobs you had, so, and where you've been and how long you've been there. So it's hard to get away from that. Yeah. But I think there are ways of kind of clubbing your experience as part of your profile, actually, which helps people see, oh, what is this person known for? This person's known for going into organizations, driving change, doing X, Y, and Z. And, you know, that might be a summary of some of the things that you've done. Yeah. Okay. Look, I know there'll be more questions. Let's keep them because I want to get through the model, at least on this call, if we don't mind. So I'm moving into that third area of performance. And, you know, I mean, clearly it helps that you work hard, okay, and you get stuff done. But I think the things to think about is think about what the business or your function, etc., are trying to achieve. And how does your work relate to that? You need to be able to articulate that as well, so that people can see that you see the connection between your work and the impact you're having to the broader organization. The other important thing I like people to do is really think about who their key stakeholders are. You know, is it just, because it's not just, you know, the odd few people that you work with, but you'll be working across functions. Your stakeholders might be your team members if you're leading people, your stakeholders, your boss's boss. It's really, what are their expectations of you, and how do you meet those expectations? That requires you to think through how you perform. It's a given that you have to have a high say-do ratio. If you said you're going to do something, get it done and go that extra mile. Often you might have to help people that actually it's not part of your job, but get known for being someone who is incredibly supportive and helpful, right? Now, I know that's hard when you've got a massive workload, but again, won't get into that detail right now. You know, I see a lot of people going into meetings, but saying nothing, thinking, okay, well, do you actually contribute? You know, how can you show that you're adding value? Often you get asked to do tasks, especially if it's coming from a different part of the organization, and the answer is often, I can't do that, sorry. Before you go into you can't do that, or think about how you can frame it so it's coming across much more positively, you know, versus having that kind of, so, you know, how can you have that can-do mental state and come across as that person in the organization? If you get opportunities to take on qualifications, experience, learning, take all the opportunities that are given to you, because this is how, you know, this is how you grow, right? And I think I can't emphasize this enough, and I could probably do a whole session on why it's so critical to have a strong relationship with your manager. The number of people who tell me, can't stand my boss, oh my God. Look, we're always going to have somewhere in our careers people that we work with that we either don't respect, don't rate, etc. But that relationship with your boss is absolutely key. And if you go around constantly criticizing your boss, believe me, it's going to come back to you. So again, could do a whole session on that, but it's really critical. And, you know, I spend a lot of time in my coaching on getting people to really develop that strong relationship, because it's a big fast track promoter factor, okay, in being able to get on with your boss and finding the strengths in your manager. And more importantly, if you're a leader and if you want to accelerate your career and be promoted, the quickest way to get promoted is actually building a strong team below you. When we used to look at promotion decisions, we would take the organization chart, remove the leader off the page and say, okay, what does this team look like? And if that team was a really strong team below them with fantastic star players, we would automatically promote the person who was heading that team, because it showed that they had grown, developed, brought in fantastic talent and also grown them, which meant that they're capable of doing bigger and better things. So please don't hold people back in your team, grow them. It's pretty critical for your performance. When I talk about performance, I also like to talk about it's not just what you deliver, but how you deliver it, the behaviors that you have. So think about behavior, because that's really what's going to determine your brand and how people perceive you in the organization. You know, as Jeff Bezos says, it's really your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. And, you know, I quite like to ask people, you know, what are the 3 words that come to mind that describes this person? And it's interesting what adjectives people use, and that's your brand. And you might not like your brand. So I think it's important to, first of all, figure out what your brand is. People don't even realize they have a brand already in their business. So how do you improve your brand? Well, firstly, talk to the various stakeholders you have. Great ways to get 360 feedback, which is, you know, talking to your, not only your peers, your team, your manager, your customers, your suppliers. Get a feel for what they think, you know, what do they see as your strengths? Where do they think you can improve? This gives you amazing insight. And sometimes they're going to tell you things you don't want to hear. And it's going to be upsetting, but actually that feedback is a gift, and take that criticism well, because if you listen to their insights and you can actually change aspects of your behavior, the chances are that's going to help you improve, because perception is reality, whether you like it or not. So the best advice I can give here is, when you get criticized by your boss or your peers, stop, think, why do they think that of me? I must be doing something that gives them that impression. Don't take it personally. And then start working on your behaviors. Look at how you can change so that they perceive you as something different to how you saw yourself, perhaps. So that's absolutely critical. Again, going to pause, Jeremy, because I know I'm going through a lot of content in a short space of time, but any quick thoughts that come to your mind?
Yeah, well, I was going to say you've got to be clear that sometimes professional criticism is not personal criticism, and to split those two, which I know you mentioned.
Exactly right.
Something that's come through a couple of different times from various people are things like, what happens if you are ignored by your managers, or you've got a manager that deliberately obstructs you, so you can't speak up in meetings, or your contributions aren't valued, or you don't get to showcase your brand, or the fact that you can develop yourself because you're having poor leadership, basically from above, either by incompetence or deliberate malice. So I guess
and that does occur, and quite often, actually, sadly. Look, I think you've got to pinpoint why your manager is being obstructive. Is it that you just don't have a great relationship? Is it that you did something that's just really cheesed them off, right? Is it that, so I think you've got to look into why that's the case. And perhaps there are things that you've done, or you didn't do a project on time that you're supposed to, that's kind of made them think, oh, you're completely unreliable. And so now they're going to get in the way. Or sometimes a manager might just use a threat because they're thinking, oh gosh, this person's trying to do my job, you know. So this is what I mean about, you could almost run a whole session on building that relationship with your manager. And actually what I would say is the onus is on you. Sadly, it's what you can control, which means that if it means having a coffee with your manager, sitting down and looking at, and perhaps being humble and saying, hey, I'm clearly, you know, I would like to do better. I realize I'm not perhaps doing things in the way that you'd like me to do things. What's missing? What would you like me to do differently? Get them to speak up, but then don't be defensive. Listen to what's being said. If it really isn't about you and this person's just a malice individual who just treats everybody badly, and that happens too, then maybe that is because, the main reason people leave their jobs is because they don't like the manager, right? It's still one of the main reasons. But actually, if you've tried and done all the things on your part, and often people haven't, if you have, then perhaps that is the only option. But again, think that through. Think, do I have to leave an organization? Could I perhaps look at working for somebody else in the same organization? There's all sorts of options here. But it's a great question, Jeremy. I hope that I've kind of touched on it very quickly.
Yeah, I was going to say very, very quickly on it, to go to the brand conversation you've just said, which is sometimes you get stuck in a cycle where you're like, oh, my manager hates me. Oh, this manager never listens to me. And then take that experience and frustration, talk to somebody who's not involved and say, am I being unreasonable? Or are they actually out?
Do other people see you the same way? Exactly. And I will come into that when I talk about the next section. Actually segues in quite nicely. Thanks, Jeremy, for that. In terms of partnerships, right? And other people in the organization or inside and out. So look, as I said, people assume performance is the thing. If you do great work, people are going to promote you. Sadly, it's not always like that, okay? There's so many other factors, like the relationships you have with people, as I said, and this is not just about your manager. It's also about the networks and how do you establish your own board of directors. I'm going to come into all of that now. But before I do, look, I can't say this enough. And it's collaborate. The reason I say this is I see so many behaviors in organizations where people don't want to help somebody else. If you go out your way for others, you'll find that will help you in some shape or form. Goodness comes back, and I think you want to be perceived in the business as someone who is incredibly collaborative, who at least is going to listen to other viewpoints and is going to help where they can. Okay. So start building a reputation and, think about the relationships. I also like people to sort of rate the relationships they have with their key stakeholders. So I'll say, rate out of 10, what's your relationship with this key stakeholder? They might say it's 4. Okay, what can you do to get it to a 10? The better relationships that you have with key people in the organizations, you're going to be able to influence things much more. You're going to be able to progress much faster. It sounds obvious, but you'd be amazed how many people just don't do any of this stuff. Networks, I'm sure you've seen this before, but 85% of jobs are filled via networking. Yet I still get leaders saying to me, oh, Sameena, I don't have time to network. Okay, well, sorry, but it's actually pretty critical. And by networking, again, this is just simply about building relationships, right? That's both inside the organization as well as outside the organization. And it might be, external ones might be within your industry, because you don't know when you'll be looking to want to switch, roles. I can honestly say most of the jobs that I was offered, even in GE, was because of the networks I had. It's because I put my hand up to do a project with another GE business sector, like a healthcare business, and found after working with them on a project, they asked me, got a job here, would you be interested in it? If I hadn't done that, there's no way I'd have been approached about that job. So think about the networks that you have. They are pretty critical. And the other important factor is, unless you make time in your calendar to build relationships and network, it probably won't happen because you'll always be too busy. So it almost needs proactive planning, and you should see it as part and parcel of you being able to do a better job and not feel guilty about it. Okay, and that's kind of on the, and I mentioned earlier, establishing your personal board of directors. You might think, well, what on earth is that? Well, this is what Jeremy was talking about earlier, right? Where, you've got it's fantastic if you've got mentors or advisors who can help guide you, whether it might be that they have the same functional expertise as you. So identify them in the organization, go up and say, hey, I'd love, are you prepared to give me an hour a month or hour every quarter to just, help me through some areas of my work, just so that I can get your advice, input, etc. Don't be shy asking people to mentor you. People often like it. They might not have time, but you'd be amazed how many people agree to mentor you. And I've mentored people and then ended up offering them jobs at the end of it. Sponsors, they're different to mentors because they might not be people you're necessarily going to for advice, but there might be people that you have worked with in the past, or people who see what you're doing and will vouch for you when you're applying for a job. The person who's going to call your boss and say, this person is fantastic, give them that job. You need to have sponsors to be able to progress. You've got to build a strong set of sponsors. And again, a lot more can be talked about on that, but I'm not going to get stuck on it. Otherwise, we won't progress. But you can see there are role models that you might want to aspire to. You need peers, both current and as well as past teammates that you can go to for advice. People who just make you feel good when you're having a hard time at work. It might be your spouse, might be a partner, might be a friend. Really, people are going to give you a hug and say, look, you're going to be fine. You might want to have an external coach, again, more objective view of kind of how you're doing and how you can get better, who can maybe help you see your blind spots and also help to stretch you and challenge you. So there's a lot of ways you can establish your own board of directors. And then this is an area I get asked about a lot, which is organization politics, right? Look, politics exists in most workplaces. If you don't have any politics in your organization, fantastic, great, but it's rare. So part of the thing is almost accept it's going to be there. Best way is obviously to avoid getting embroiled into the politics with all the gossip, the chatter, etc. But also but you have to be aware of it, okay? And again, I think I mentioned earlier about the relationship with your stakeholders and how you can strengthen that. That's going to help you manage that politics, because you want to be seen as somebody who's respectful, somebody who is, a co-worker that people want to work with. And if you do have to challenge people, find ways of doing it constructively versus getting very emotional about it, getting it so it becomes personal. And there will be times where people have done things that are terrible to you, right? Forgive and forget. I know this sounds easy, but honestly, if you get hung up on things, it's going to get in the way of your career. The more you can move on and brush it off, the better you're going to be positioned to be able to progress and not let other things become barriers. So that's really on the side, all to do with relationships in the organization as well as outside the organization. Again, Jeremy, I'm going to pause for just a minute. Any kind of thoughts that are coming to mind, or any kind of quick questions?
There are questions, but not specifically on the organization politics. There are questions that all come up. One that has been asked a couple of times is, it's not, what other things can you bring that isn't just your experience? So how do you input education? There's been a couple of interesting questions about how age is sometimes seen as an obstacle at both ends of the spectrum. Oh, you're too young to do this, or you're too old to go for this job, and how you tackled those sorts of things, which I don't know if we have time to get into, but we can.
We probably don't, but I mean, sometimes it also is about organization culture. I've been in organizations where it's not unusual to have a CEO who's 30. Okay, it's not about age, but yet I've known organizations where that doesn't happen unless you eat 55. You know what I mean? So it's so really sometimes you're restricted by the organization culture, but often it's also about you and how you work with those constraints. And I've known people who to overcome those constraints, but probably can't get into all the detail right now, but I think it's a valid question. So thanks for asking that. Let me move on to the last area, which is all about pivoting, right? There will be times in your career where you're faced with a challenge, a difficult challenge. It might be a health issue. It could be that you're suddenly facing redundancy, or it could be the situation where technology's improved and AI and robots have taken your job. But how do you see that coming? And then also, how do you learn to pivot and do something different, adapt, to make it more of an opportunity, right? And how do you stay resilient? I see a lot of people often getting burnt out in the workplace because they're working so hard in the hours. So, how do you ensure that you are a resilient individual who is able to cope with that change? And again, just a few thoughts here, probably not enough time to get into a lot of detail, but often, I've seen people, and sadly, I've been at the other end where I'm having to make somebody redundant, and I can be quite sensitive and upset, even though I might have had to do this a lot of times in my career. But I've seen how people react, and the ones who bounce back see it as an opportunity, a challenge, a time to perhaps reflect and reinvent themselves. So it's also how you frame a situation in your mind, whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty person. Always important to focus on what you can control. A lot of things are going on in the organization, a lot of change, and people are like, oh my God, there's so much uncertainty. Okay, well, you can't control that. Just control what's in your own domain. Remember, in the end, it could be that you're worrying so much about your job, but what's the bigger picture? It's in the end, it's a job, right? Yes, it might be a career, but always think much bigger than what's right in front of you. And, keep your North Star in mind, your purpose, what you're trying to achieve. And sometimes you have to take risks. When I chose to leave a corporate career, I didn't know anything about having my own business, but you have to sometimes be prepared to take that risk and actually, feel that this is something you really want to do. It's an opportunity that you just want to take up. I often get asked questions around burnout. I think, it's so critical to have time in your life to make sure that you're being mentally refreshed, physically. People stop going to the gym, they stop exercising, they don't have time for their friends, they don't take time to be practice mindfulness because they're just so busy with work. It eventually catches up on you. It eventually leads to the burnout because you have not made time for those important things to keep yourself refreshed. And, even if something, awful happens, say in your job and you have to leave, etc., practice gratitude. There may be some great experiences that you've had in this current job that you can look back on and feel very grateful for. So there's a lot of ways that you can reframe the situation and feel that it's time to refresh and reinvent yourself. And that's really going to help you to the next success of your career and following that path. And that kind of gets me to the conclusion of the 5 areas. And I know I've kind of done a very quick whistle stop tour of these different parts of the framework, but I hope it gives you a taster of the sort of things you need to be thinking about. And I'm very conscious of the time. So I guess, Jeremy, we don't really have time for questions, but luckily we have another session next week. So people can use that.
We do indeed, yes. And everybody who's asked questions today, if we haven't got to them, I've got a record. We'll keep a transcript, and we'll make sure we include them next week in the dedicated Q&A session. Sameena, thank you so much. I can't believe this hour's gone past so fast.
I know. It's been a pleasure, real pleasure.
It's been really great. Thanks everybody else for attending on a Wednesday lunchtime. I know it's sometimes hard to get that time in the middle of the day, so thank you for coming. We hope to see you all next week. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays, everybody.
Yeah, please. Get your questions in.
Yeah, send them in. And we'll see you hopefully next week.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Please do connect with me. Take care.